right. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our Retirement Income Intel webinar this month. My name is Malkley. I will be your MC, joined by our two speakers, Justin and Derek. We are excited for another great session. For our returning users, welcome back. To our new visitors, welcome to Retirement Income Intel by Income Lab. This is a great time where we put together each month a space for Justin and Derek to really talk about specific topics in retirement income planning. And it's another great time to really hear your questions as well. So we first have a presentation, and then we will open it up for Q&A after the presentation. You will see the Q&A section in the Zoom webinar here. So please go ahead and drop those questions there. You can also upvote other people's questions. And so afterwards, we will work through the most voted questions first. Also, after this webinar, you will see a survey to fill out your responses. This is a CE approved webinar, so you will also be able to give us your CFP CE ID so we can make sure you get the credit as well. And then you will also be able to note if you would like to have one of our team members reach out to you if you'd like to hear more about Income Lab specifically. All right, guys, that is my spiel. Justin, Derek, I will turn it over to you guys, and I will be back for the Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Malkley. Thanks, Derek. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Yeah, so we have two webinars each month, more of a Q&A and a focus on practice in our Lab Talk Tuesdays. This is more of our research-oriented, topics in retirement income planning webinar. And as Malkley said, there's CE here, so definitely stick around to the end and fill out the questionnaire to get your CE credit. So today we're really diving into some things that Derek and I have found in applying Income Lab's new stress test to some other ways to do adjustment-based planning, and specifically withdrawal rate guardrails. So I think this will be really good for people who have toyed with guardrails in the past, or know people who have, to kind of take those concepts out of academia and see how they apply or don't, as the case may be, in real life, and what we can do better. Okay, so here's the outline. And actually, Derek presented something adjacent to this on kitsis.com maybe last month. So also, if you're interested in more of this type of content, definitely check that out if you're members over there. So the outline, I'm going to start kind of high level with, why you would want to have adjustments and guardrails in retirement. I think that's a key to just step back before we get into the weeds on, the specifics of how you might guide a client through retirement and advise them on changes in spending. What's the point of all this? Then we'll dive into withdrawal rate guardrails, what they are and why they don't work in practice. And then we'll talk about risk-based guardrails, which is a more holistic approach and does work better in practice. Okay, so why adjustments? I think the key behind this idea that retirement income planning is really about an ongoing management and guidance process is that if you set someone off on their retirement journey, spending a certain amount or following a certain spending plan, then you get this incredible array of possible outcomes, many of which I think you could reasonably call failure. So what we're used to talking about as failure is running out of money. And if you've seen a Monte Carlo analysis chart like this with portfolio balance, this will be familiar to you. This concept that, hey, if you just followed this plan blindly, you might run out of money, at some percentage chance or some amount of the time. But many have also noticed that actually often these analyses also show that in a huge amount of the time, you end up with way more money at the end of the plan than you had hoped for. So that is also failure. Now, it's probably not as bad a type of failure as running out of money, but it's sort of a overly frugal, too much, you've restricted your lifestyle more than you had to. Maybe you've foregone certain spending that really might have improved your quality of life. So the main reason you might be interested in adjustments in retirement is that this picture, if it really is a representation of the possible outcomes of retirement portfolios, just shows that this would be a terrible way to run retirement. That the outcomes are just way too broad. We can do better. We can provide a range of outcomes with a much narrower range, simply by adjusting along the way. This is any kind of complex situation where we don't know the future, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, kind of needs to have steering. It needs to have adjustments as a possibility. So what you're seeing here is treating retirement as if it's like shooting a bottle rocket in the air. Well, it's just going to land wherever it lands. We'll see. Versus a space shuttle or something with an actual steering wheel, or it's Pinewood Derby cars versus an actual car with a steering wheel and a brake pedal and an accelerator. So retirement is one of those complicated situations where we learn what world we're living through as time goes on, and so not to adjust would be kind of crazy. And actually, a lot of the research on retirement income, even rules of thumb like the 4% rule, in that research, for example, Bill Bengen actually talks about adjusting at the end of that article. So he's not saying this is what you should do and you should do it without adjusting. So the idea that people should have a plan for adjustments, a method of doing adjustments in retirement, is very old and I think well-founded. Because adjustments help us avoid two things: running out of money or overspending. So if we discover that we're in a world that, it's a little tougher than we had hoped, adjustments help us tap the brakes on spending or make other adjustments to kind of keep things in line. And they also help us avoid leaving too much money behind or underspending. So if we discover that we're actually in a world where that's supporting a higher spending level, maybe that's because returns have been particularly good, or because inflation's been particularly low, or any number of other things, we need to know that additional spending is available and have the opportunity to take advantage of that as retirees and clients. So what our goal is to kind of optimize income along the way and take the best path possible, given what we know, given our resources, and kind of land where we're hoping to land. So this picture where the outcomes are really zeroing in on, in this case, maybe it's a desired legacy goal, is the ideal situation. Now, of course, we don't live in an ideal world. To do this, you would have to know the future. You'd have to know exactly when someone was going to die. So that's unlikely. However, it is possible to at least kind of shrink the range of outcomes and get close to optimizing for retirement spending along the way, just by paying attention and giving people advice on when they can adjust their income up and when they should adjust their income down or make other changes to remove risk from the plan. So that's at a very high level why you would want to use adjustments in retirement. It's because if you don't, you're kind of just making a decision at the beginning of the retirement and hoping things work out. And you're also ignoring a bunch of information that you get along the way and where you can update your plan. Okay. So second question is, what are guardrails? Given that we might want to adjust along the way, there's also been a lot of work, particularly in the practitioner world, on methods for doing this, analysis methods, methods for actually delivering adjustment advice to clients. And I'm going to focus on the guardrail concept here because it is probably the most discussed and the most used approach to adjustments in the retirement planning space. And the concept is just this. People would prefer not to make more changes than they have to. So guardrails really say, okay, there is a range at which I'll just keep spending what I'm spending, or I'll just keep following the plan that I have, because there's a cost to making adjustments. It can be kind of annoying, it's administratively burdensome, and frankly, you can overdo it and be whipsawed on making adjustments. And so there is kind of this range in the middle where you can see this kind of light gray, no change. It's the no change range, where you just follow the plan. However, if risk gets quote unquote too low, meaning you're getting information that, hey, actually things are going pretty well. The world we're living through is better than we had expected or better than we'd hoped. And there's a chance to increase spending if we want to. So that's this green guardrail. On the other hand, there's this red guardrail, which is risk is getting too high. So we need to decrease spending. So things have gone worse than expected. Maybe inflation has been higher than expected, or returns have been worse than expected. Or maybe even just somebody has spent more than they had originally planned to. And so that has made future spending have to go down. So the idea is to set these guardrails in a way that they trigger adjustments at a point where it really makes sense to, where it's a big enough deal that it'll impact the future risk of the plan, and it's administratively worthwhile. So you're kind of trying to balance those two sides of things. Any adjustment will affect the risk of the plan, but you don't want to do them so often that it's whipsawing people all over the place, making them change lifestyles. And so that's why you can think of these as guardrails, because they're not going to be, kind of hitting the car all the time, right? We can sort of let the car sort of drift, back and forth. But hey, if we get too far out, let's course correct. So that's the concept of a guardrail at, again, very high level. This is just conceptual. Let's get a little bit more specific. So specifically, when would risk be too low, rather, with a green guardrail? Well, it's if the income that you're paying yourself is too low given your situation. One particularly clear way that's possible is if your balance is quote unquote too high. So you have some goal of maybe a legacy goal, could be zero, could be $1 million. You have some plan length, you have some expectations, and it sure looks like you got plenty of money given your current income level. And so you could afford to spend more. You could afford to pay yourself extra. On the other hand, if income is too high given your resources and your plan and your goals, the balance is too low given your plan and resources and goals, then it's time to decrease the amount that you're paying yourself. Okay, one step further. What are withdrawal rate guardrails? That's the main sort of guardrail that people have really focused on in this research, have been on what is the amount you're taking from your portfolio, your retirement portfolio, as a rate. So if I'm taking $50,000 a year from $1 million portfolio, that's a 5% withdrawal rate. So measuring what's too high or too low based on that rate. And there have been a lot of approaches to this and variations on that theme. And this is where, okay, if your withdrawal rate is too low, so maybe you have a 30-year plan and the withdrawal rate is 2%, that's probably too low. So let's increase withdrawals. That can happen over time if the balance is getting up there, right? If you keep taking $50,000 a year and your $800,000 portfolio goes to $1 million and then 1.2 million, your withdrawal rate is going down, 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 and it's good news for you. You can spend more. Withdrawal rate guardrails on the bottom are the opposite. So if your withdrawal rate is too high, it's because the withdrawals you're taking from that portfolio, it's too high of a percentage. So if that balance went from $1 million to 800 to 500 and you're still taking $50,000, now it's a 10% withdrawal. That feels too high. So you can see intuitively why this would make sense to people, because one of the key risks that we know of in retirement is sequence of return risk, which is specifically related to portfolio withdrawals. So we kind of want an alarm bell to sound if it looks like we're taking too much from our portfolio, stressing it too much, and having higher sequence of return risk. On the other hand, we also want an alarm bell to sound if there's good news and we actually could be spending more. So it's really intuitive how these withdrawal rates connect to this idea that risk could be too high or too low. Okay. There is a problem, though, with withdrawal rate guardrails. There's a couple of them. And Derek and I have written about this before in other contexts. We're going to focus on some other problems today primarily, but I'll mention those other problems. One is you can actually only apply withdrawal rate guardrails, at least the sorts that we'll be going over today, to plans that only have withdrawals in them. And typically only plans that plan to have flat income or flat spending, meaning just inflation adjusted spending over time. Nothing fancy, nothing where you spend more early in the plan, less later in the plan, nothing where you're paying off a mortgage, nothing where there's anything lumpy in the plan. So, and this is because these approaches were developed basically as academic concepts. And when you do that, when you write articles, research articles, you typically simplify things so that the topic you're focused on can come through and it won't be distracting that there are other issues in the plan. However, that's not actually how most plans work. It's pretty rare to have someone only have portfolio withdrawals. But even for those plans that do, for example, someone who has already started Social Security, has a portfolio, and that's it, there's a second problem, which is that when withdrawal rate guardrail systems are tested through tough times, at least the most commonly used ones, the ones that we've tested, perform really poorly. So even if you have a plan that in principle you could use withdrawal rate guardrails for because it has a simple shape of portfolio withdrawals, the problem is when it's tested, kind of like, I don't know what you'd call it, FDA level 1, does it cause harm? It sure looks like it does. So it looks like it doesn't work. So just to make that first point again, one problem with withdrawal rate guardrails is they only make sense for withdrawal only plans with flat income. But if you have a plan like this, where you've got some part-time work, Social Security being delayed, and so on, the withdrawals themselves could look like this dark blue, which Derek and I have called the retirement distribution hatchet. So you can see kind of the blade of the hatchet and then the handle. And when your plan is to take withdrawals in a lumpy way, first higher, then lower again, finally changing over time, it's going to be almost impossible to apply withdrawal rate guardrails. However, we're going to test withdrawal rate guardrails using a withdrawal only plan. Again, if you had Social Security layered underneath this, that would also be fine. So that would be a plan that you could, in principle, apply withdrawal rate guardrails to, and it wouldn't be nonsensical. It would be fairly nonsensical to try to apply it to a plan like this. It would not yield good results. It wouldn't even yield results that you could evaluate. It would just be kind of silly. Okay, so let's take a look at this. In order to stress test withdrawal rate guardrails, we have to choose a specific version of withdrawal rate guardrails. And the kind of the most adopted approach to this is probably the Guyton-Klinger withdrawal rate guardrails. Again, these were proposed as part of a research project around adjustments and guardrails in retirement. And so they were produced in a really, kind of I don't know, in the lab, basically, where everything, it was distilled water and, perfect temperature, right? And so there is something I appreciate about this work that was done in I think 2004, 2006, 2008, which is that it drew the industry's attention toward adjustments and actually coming up with systems that could be applied in principle in a practice to help actual retirement clients. So I really appreciate that about this work. And that's one reason that I've chosen it, is that it was kind of high profile and has been adopted in some cases. So the approach of Guyton-Klinger we have here, there are several articles, so I've kind of taken the most recent ones and gotten rid of some of the things from the early ones that Guyton and Klinger also kind of jettisoned along the way. But the idea is you have an initial withdrawal rate. It could be anything. And then you have a couple of ways to adjust that income. So say, for example, you started out, your portfolio balance is $1 million. You have a 5% withdrawal rate, that's $50,000. As time goes on, you keep asking, okay, how much am I withdrawing? And then in this case, there are a couple of variables that Guyton and Klinger propose. One is, okay, how much higher or lower does your withdrawal rate have to get for you to make an adjustment? And in this case, I've gone with 20%, which is what they do in their articles as well. And then if you hit a guardrail, what do you do to that dollar withdrawal? And in this case, I've gone with 10%, which is again from their articles. They do have a few other pieces that we have used in this test. One is if the trailing 12-month return is negative, skip the inflation adjustment. So these are, again, they're flat plans for inflation adjusted income will stay flat, but it's saying, hey, we'll decrease our real spending. If I ever have a trailing 12-month period that's negative, I'll just skip the inflation adjustment, which has the effect of reducing my real spending. And the last thing is that there are no decreases triggered by guardrails in the final 15 years of the plan. Okay, so those are the 4 pieces of the Guyton-Klinger system. Pretty simple. And because of that, has been adopted in a lot of cases. So let's do an example. We've got, let's assume it's a 5% initial withdrawal, got $1 million, we're taking $50,000 a year. Over time, that balance is going up and down. And finally, it hits 1.3 million at some point. Well, at that point, $50,000 is about 3.8, 3.9% withdrawal. That withdrawal rate is now below 4%. So I'm going to increase my withdrawal by 10% to 55,000. Time goes on further, balance goes up and down. Eventually the balance hits 850,000. My withdrawal rate is 6.5%. That's 55,000 divided by 850. And so I'm going to reduce my spend now by 10%. You could have multiple increases, you could have multiple decreases. This is just the kind of the way things work along the way. Okay, so what we did is we took Income Lab's new stress test feature, and this is not available in our kind of normal environment. So this was something that we kind of did offline to test this particular Guyton-Klinger approach through some of these difficult and iconic periods in time to see how they would have reacted, how income would have changed, how withdrawals would have changed, how spending would have changed over time if someone had actually followed this approach to guardrails. And again, this is a plan that only has withdrawals. So it's not subject to that problem that we saw before of if you have lumpy withdrawals, it just becomes nonsensical. This really is a place where you could have used this. If I started those withdrawals in November of 2007, just before the global financial crisis, I end up at the worst point, 28% below my plan. I have 3 income decreases before I start recovering again. You'll notice because when the plan is 15 years or shorter, we're not going to see those red lines because we don't do the guardrail-based adjustments at that point. So that's why typically toward the end of the plan, you'll only see those green lines if you're going to see them at all. So not great. Before the dot-com bubble, if I'd started in January of 99, I get something a bit worse. I spend some time, in this case, multiple years at 36% below my originally planned level. If I started after the Great Depression, or after kind of the core part of the 2020 or 1929 Great Depression, so 1936, we're still kind of in the Great Depression. I guess technically it may have ended by this point, but the recovery was a while after that. We end up 45% below plan kind of in the middle of the plan. And if I start in 1965, which is about the worst time you possibly could have started, I end up at worse 54% below plan by following this. Now, in all of these cases, we do recover later on because we've paused the red lines, right, and we're allowing the green lines to still happen. The only thing that is still applying is the skipping of inflation adjustments. So those are continued throughout the plan, but everything else is only green toward the end of a plan. So the fact that when you stress test this approach in practice with actual historical returns, actual historical inflation, that this approach doesn't work all that well, this is not actually new information. So I want to give credit to Wade Pfau, who did a lot of testing on adjustment approaches, very comprehensive survey, and he had a particular way of kind of trying to measure how adjustment approaches perform. And he found that, in a Monte Carlo test, there was at least a 10% chance following a Guyton-Klinger rule of reducing withdrawals by as much as 84% throughout a 30-year plan. Now that's only a 10% chance of that, but that's really a striking amount of reduction. I certainly wouldn't call it anything near success or what most people could handle. Yeski also noted, and he has a whole series online if you're interested, just that we probably shouldn't expect withdrawal rate guardrails to be some kind of miracle. So Guyton-Klinger does not afford you to miraculously increase your withdrawal amount without any drawback. The higher the initial withdrawal amount, the higher the risk of massive spending cuts in the future. Okay, so this is not a free lunch, and that's basically what Yeski's saying here. Part of the issue with withdrawal rate guardrails is if people focus on the withdrawal rate itself, as opposed to the dollar amount being withdrawn and spent, it can look better than it is. So you can show that someone is able to spend 5% or more over the lifetime of their plan as an average withdrawal rate, but that's sort of irrelevant. What we actually want to know is what's my income, what's my spending, right? I can't go to the grocery store and give them a percentage. I have to give them a dollar amount. And so I think that's one reason that the weakness of these approaches hasn't been so clear, is people have often focused on withdrawal rate as the core way to measure whether a plan is good or not. Whereas in fact, it's standard of living, which is dollar-based, in particular, inflation-adjusted dollar-based. So again, this has been known for 8 years, possibly plus, and this is our work here is just extending that and hopefully helping people who haven't heard that to see what's going on here. So why does this withdrawal rate guardrail approach, this particular one, Guyton-Klinger, not work? Why is it performing so poorly in these tough periods in history? One reason is that the guardrails themselves are not refigured or updated as a plan goes on and the plan gets shorter. So we're using the same guardrail level throughout the plan. Now, we're not applying the lower guardrail at the, in the latter part of the plan, but all of the guardrail, they stay the same. So if I started at 5% and my lower guardrail, the point at which I would decrease my income was 6, it's 6 throughout the plan. If my upper guardrail, the one that allowed me to spend more, was 4%, it's 4% throughout the plan. So nothing is being updated to reflect the fact that as people age, their risks change. A 6% withdrawal is not the same for an 80-year-old as it is for a 60-year-old. These guardrails also don't incorporate the possibility of reversion to the mean. So there's nothing about, if things have gotten worse, is it now equally likely that things continue to get worse or that they revert? But probably most important is that the values for the guardrails themselves and the adjustments, although they sound reasonable, they are, in the final analysis, arbitrary. So they weren't produced by really looking at the particular plan with its plan length, its resources, its risks. Instead, they were kind of rules of thumb. Again, for a research paper, that's reasonable, but we shouldn't expect that we could take those kind of rules of thumb, general, hey, these feel right type numbers, and apply them to a real plan and get good results. So that 20% buffer between the guardrails or the 10% adjustment, again, they don't sound unreasonable, but they are, in the end, arbitrary. They're not linked to the particular plan and its risks. Similarly, skipping an inflation adjustment, it's easy to implement, but it's arbitrary, right? The amount that you're reducing spending in real terms is just based on whatever inflation happened to be over the last 12 months. So that could have been 2%, it could have been 8%. So the adjustment itself is now dependent on something else. Similarly, skipping the decreases in the final 15 years of plan, although that may seem reasonable, that number is arbitrary. Should it be 15? Is it that there is no risk now in a plan that's shorter than 15 years? Are adjustments no longer important? Probably not. Instead, it's kind of an arbitrary piece. And that, I think, is the core to why withdrawal rate guardrails and Guyton-Klinger in particular performs so poorly. Just to go over the first one, why not updating withdrawal rate guardrails is such a big problem. The risk of a given withdrawal rate, again, in a plan with only withdrawals in it and flat inflation-adjusted withdrawals, is not the same as you age. So whatever your success rate that you'd like to maintain, whether it's 50 or 100, you'll see that you can withdraw more and more as you age because, of course, your plan is getting shorter and shorter. Now, it's probably never 0 years, right? We always have some life expectancy ahead of us. But we can see here, if we had a 6% reduce income guardrail or a 4% increase income guardrail, as time goes on, these curves are getting up into the 6%. And so I'm going to be reducing my income even if my risk hasn't changed. So maybe I want to start out at the green level here, the 75% success. Well, by the time I'm about 75, 76 years old, a 6% withdrawal has the same risk as my original 5% withdrawal. And so I wouldn't want to adjust at that point because my risk hasn't actually changed. However, the withdrawal rate guardrails would have me adjust. So this is a case where withdrawal rate guardrails can actually, if they were followed, they could cause you to make adjustments that are not necessary or even in the opposite direction of what really would be right if what you're focusing on is keeping people's risk in line. So what's an alternative? The alternative is to take a broader view of risk. We call this income risk or retirement income risk. It is simply, what are all of the things that could make your current spending level, your current plan for future spending unsustainable, and suggest that you might want to adjust your spending downward. That's what retirement income risk is, and it can vary by plan because plans have different lengths, because people have different longevity expectations, people have different resources that they bring to retirement. You might have a pension that's not adjusted for inflation, that can add inflation risk. You might have pensions that adjust if one person dies, that can add mortality risk. You might have delayed Social Security, which increases sequence of return risk early in the plan, but decreases it later in the plan. There are so many things that can be unique to a plan that really we need a really ample definition of income risk that takes all of this into account. So it's really just the chances that the current plan won't be sustainable without adjustment. So what does that look like if we test it in the same periods? So this we call risk-based guardrails, and it is the approach to guardrails in the Income Lab software. And so although the Guyton-Klinger test is not available in our software, the risk-based tests are. So if we start this same plan, which is a crude plan with withdrawals only, nothing fancy, it does see a reduction in the global financial crisis, but at most it's 3% below plan versus 28% below plan. For the dot-com bubble, with risk-based guardrails, this is something we've seen quite a bit, that really the dot-com bubble for reasonably conservative plans rarely has an adjustment. So although at the time this felt particularly bad, and certainly there were segments of the economy that were really hurt in this period, and it was a relatively extended period. If you had a balanced portfolio, if you were not taking excess risk, if you weren't trying to push your portfolio too hard, you actually didn't have any adjustments down. And we see that here, which compares really well to the Guyton-Klinger approach, which had you decreasing income through the dot-com bubble and actually ending up 36% below plan, never getting back above plan. What about this particularly bad period in the Great Depression? So starting in 1936. One reason this is a little bit worse than 29, and this is actually, Bengen also mentions this in his article in 94, was that there was a lot of deflation in the early Great Depression, which helped a lot of plans. So this skips some of it, but we still get some of the bad returns. And so I end up, again, decreasing quite a bit. I'm 45% below plan with Guyton-Klinger. I am 8% below plan at worst with risk-based guardrails. It's worth looking at the time period as well. Now, this is a relatively long period that's 8% below plan for the risk-based guardrails. But note, it's almost the entire plan that you're below plan for Guyton-Klinger. The worst performing period for both risk-based guardrails for this plan and for Guyton-Klinger is this stagflation era. This is the source of the 4% rule. I purposely pushed income high enough that we would see some turmoil. If I'd kept it to 4%, obviously this would have performed just fine because that's where the 4% rule came from. And so I spend almost all the plan below plan with Guyton-Klinger at worst, 11 years at about 54% below, meaning less than half of my original plan spending. It's pretty bad for risk-based guardrails too. In this case, 3 years spent at 32% below plan. So probably in this case, it would have been, you may have been looking at some other options. This one is actually worth pulling up the details of, because it's sort of interesting. This is a little bit of a side note, but this period of high inflation is really instructive. It's instructive to look at what the nominal amounts would have been over time, because you had a lot of inflation in this period. So we were, I think this is the one. We had so much inflation that just spending an inflation-adjusted, fixed real dollar amount, that the light blue that you see here. I mean, look at this, from 65, where we start with 35.90 until 96 would have been 17,600. So, and that is the same dollar amount from one period to the end in purchasing power terms. And so maybe this gives like a slightly better view of what the actual experience would have been like for people. So it's essentially flattening the nominal dollar amount for Guyton-Klinger from 69, roughly through 85. And then for risk-based guardrails, it's from about 79 to 85, that we're just sort of going sideways with our nominal withdrawals. So that might give you a better feel for what that would have felt like. It would have felt like your spendable withdrawals were just stagnating as things got more and more expensive. So that's what belt tightening would have looked like. And I think that's a pretty interesting, just bit of context. Okay, so why are risk-based guardrails working better? The primary things are, now the guardrails themselves are not arbitrary. They're based on all the risks of the plan itself at each point in time. So it incorporates the whole plan. Even if it's withdrawals only, it's incorporating the whole plan, including the amount of plan that remains, what's happened with the capital market assumptions, economic context, and so on. And it's updating the guardrails along the way. So it's much more dynamic. They're not static guardrails. And then for a broader plan, you're taking more risks into account. You're taking longevity and mortality risk, inflation risk, and market risk. So you're able to apply these guardrails to a broader set of plans. So that's really the core of why these are performing so much better. With that, I know we have some questions, but I want to bring Derek in here to kind of talk a little bit about, well, if he has any comments on the material so far, but also I know advisors often find withdrawal rate guardrails really attractive because they're easy to talk about, they feel intuitive, and so on. So I wondered if you have some thoughts on client communication, risk-based guardrails versus withdrawal rate guardrails, and are there things I should be worried about as an advisor if I've been using withdrawal rate guardrails?
Yeah, I think for me, I try to keep it really simple. I think there's always the tendency that, a client has read not even so much about risk-based guardrails, but 4% rule, anything like that, where they want to get, overly fixated on a particular distribution rate. And so I like to use the graphic in Income Lab where I can show cash flows and I can show, what you're actually taking from your portfolio doesn't fit this, similar pattern all across time, unless, for some people it could be if they're particularly, 72 and beyond, they're taking RMDs or, doing all that. That would be a situation where maybe that's going to be a little bit more flat distribution in that case. But for most of my clients, it looks like the hatchet that we see here, where there is at least a period where they're taking at a higher distribution rate. And then, of course, if you're modeling in the spending smile, things like that, that's going to change distribution rates as well. So I like to, explain kind of why the 4% rule may not be relevant to them, why it might be okay that they're starting out taking 5, 6, 7, 8% from a portfolio if they're ultimately dropping down to a lower distribution rate longer term. And then when I talk about the guardrails, I really just like to talk about risk and say, at this point, we feel the risk has gotten too high, or at this point, the risk is low enough that you could go ahead and spend more. And I found that for me has really worked well because people kind of understand, okay, yeah, we're just talking about a general risk level here. And I tend to not go deeper into the weeds and talk about what's driving that risk level, exactly what the thresholds are. Of course, I could go there with a client if they wanted to, but most of the time that's not a question that I'm getting from clients.
Yeah, I think that point about withdrawal rates is a really important one because, like you said, if somebody's kind of out there, Googling things, they will probably see a lot of chatter about that. And, we even see, I've seen a lot of headlines in the last year or two of, oh, maybe it's 3.5% now instead of 4%. And right, it's really treated in the press as if this is the key question about retirement planning is what initial percentage of your portfolio can you withdraw? And I think it's really important to find a way to talk with clients about, in fact, even in the software, I could probably find a way to let me find an example here. That is not the shape of your withdrawals. And so do you actually think that we'll be able to find a rule of thumb that would tell you exactly the withdrawal rate you should have right now or in the future that would apply to everyone? So for example, here is, it's not the same graph, but it's similar. Right here, I just have one Social Security that's delayed. If I take these out, this is what my portfolio withdrawals look like. That is far from a flat line, right? And so what makes me think that I would have any rule of thumb that could apply across the length of this plan, and that I could apply to everyone's plan? I've sometimes toyed with the metaphor of like a swimming pool. It's deeper in some spots, but depending on the shape of the bottom, the same amount of water might fill different types of swimming pools. You got to understand that like we're trying to sort of, this is one of your resources, the yellow stuff in this case, and we're sort of spreading it out, filling in the gaps where we need it, and so on. And that's really realistic planning. So there's a need to step back from just a focus on withdrawals. I understand why people have that focus because they feel like that's the one decision they have, right? They actually have some others, like when to take Social Security and so on, but it does feel like, oh, that's the lever I can pull. So I just want an easy answer to it. The issue is that there just isn't one for most people.
Yeah. And I do think, it's certainly the point to get across to people is not that the initial withdrawal rate doesn't matter. It does matter because even at different risk levels, right? That you're still moving that initial and the long-term withdrawal rate up or down. But it's just the fact that for most people, it's not this smoothed out one constant withdrawal rate all the way through retirement. And when that's not the case, you really need to look at total risk and not just withdrawal rates.
Right. Yeah. And then I guess the other thing, I don't know if it sounds like you're able, by just staying at high level, you don't have to, address, okay, why would this change over time? But if someone were particularly attached to the 4% rule, for example, I think it would be relatively intuitive to say, look, when you're 80, you should want me to let you spend more than 4%, right? You probably don't still have a 30-year plan at that point. So I think that's also kind of an intuitive concept that, the risks of different behavior are different at different ages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other confusion, though, that can creep in there is when people start to think the 4% rule is talking about 4% of the portfolio balance every single year.
Each point,
it's not at all what the 4% rule is saying. It's saying you started out at initial 4%, and then down the road that could be 10, 15%, particularly in the scenarios where you were depleting the portfolio.
Right. Very, very good point. Okay, I think we have a bunch of questions. Malcolm, I don't know if you've had a chance to pick some out.
Yes, I have. And for our users, please feel free to check out the Q&A, upvote any of the existing questions, and drop in any of your questions as well. The one that we have the most votes on right now is a question asking, how does the asset allocation one sets up affect the guardrails? And how do I explain that in plain English to clients?
Great question. Derek, do you have thoughts on that first?
I think, just generally speaking, it's going to be driving depending on the type of analysis you're doing, it's going to be driving the market returns that you're seeing in the plan and what it's projecting out for the different risk levels. How to explain that to a client? I like to keep things simple. And so I like to really try and set up a plan that, matches the client's portfolio or is a reasonable proxy for what we're doing for a client, and just say, this really reflects a portfolio like yours, or a portfolio with a similar risk level as yours, just to keep it really high level, and not get into the weeds of like, here's how much is allocated to large cap value versus large cap growth, or anything like that.
Yeah, I think to address that question with the withdrawal rate guardrails or Guyton-Klinger guardrails in mind, that is another one of those issues with, again, these research pieces were put together, in an idealized context where it's a 30-year plan and it's a particular type of portfolio and so on. But that is one of the other problems with actually following or coming up with a Guyton-Klinger withdrawal rate guardrail plan, is really they should be different if you have a different portfolio, right? So you don't expect as much volatility in a bond portfolio as in a stock portfolio, and so on. So really, the guardrail should be different. But it's, again, because it's this, I used 20% and 10%, which is what you'll find in those papers, but they probably should be different in a different one. The problem is it's not entirely clear what they should be. In risk-based guardrails, what we're always doing is saying, okay, what would it take for my current plan with my current spending level to have a higher risk level, and like an uncomfortably higher risk level? And so that's done with the capital market expectations in mind. So if you have a less return, but also less volatility in your portfolio, you'll get a different answer than you will if it has a higher return and higher volatility portfolio. So you can simply create two plans in Income Lab, and you'll see exactly the difference there, keeping all the other risk the same. You'll see how that changes. It's similar to any other plan changes, like postponing Social Security typically increases what you can spend at a risk level because you're getting that 8% deferral bonus. But it also typically tightens the guardrails at least a little bit, which is saying you have higher sequence of return risk because you're stressing your portfolio more early on. So total risk guardrails have a great way of reflecting everything about the plan in that way.
Perfect. So we've got a few different questions all around Guyton-Klinger, as you can imagine. So I will kind of go through these next few ones. I love this one. So quick summary. So in summary, Guyton-Klinger results in income being too low and legacy being too high compared to income lab results.
Correct. Yes, I would say. Derek, you might have more subtle or nuanced answer to that, but
yeah, I mean, in summary, in terms of what you're trying to take away from it, I would also take away from it that it's really not something I would use with clients. Right? I don't think this is a framework that provides a level of downside adjustment risk that most clients are going to be comfortable with. And so really having that conversation, taking clients through the stress test with their particular plan, seeing, okay, are they comfortable with that? Then you've got a good plan for a client.
And I think this similar response here, question is, under tough times when risk-based guardrails perform better than Guyton-Klinger, would the Guyton-Klinger ending portfolio be larger?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's always, in all these examples, it's penalizing current spending in order to protect the portfolio balance, but it's doing so unnecessarily. Now, in this plan, I had a zero legacy goal. Now, you're never going to, hit a zero legacy and have your last check bounce. Not in, the real world where there's always, some life expectancy. But clearly, as the plan is farther and farther along, we have more and more of an idea of how much we can spend and still, have a positive balance at the end of our then current life expectancy. But that is exactly what is happening. It's always vastly overstating the need to keep portfolio balance in there and penalizing current spending. Now, people have different ways of prioritizing legacy and spending goals, but I've mostly seen people prioritize spending over legacy. I don't know if Derek, you have a similar experience.
Yeah, I'd say for the most part, sometimes people have a particular goal in mind of what they want their legacy to do, but for most of the clients I work with, I'd say it is more common to prioritize spending. But the nice thing, of course, with Income Lab is you can put in whatever those preferences are, and you can identify any legacy goal, if desired, as part of your plan assumptions.
Next question is, how do you know when the final 15 years of a plan is? Life expectancy is a variable, quote unquote, Guyton-Klinger.
Right. So in this, so the retirement stress test and the plan test in Income Lab is a real simulation of how you would have followed a plan, down to the very details that every month you're updating life expectancy and plan length. So in this case, we simply said, hey, if the plan at that point in time is 15 years or shorter, don't apply the downward guardrail. So it's pretty simple in Income Lab to do that. That's exactly what's happening. Even when you're looking at risk-based guardrails, it's really saying, if you as an advisor followed this plan exactly as it's supposed to be followed, including updating it every month, which happens automatically in Income Lab, at some point your plan would have shrunk to 15 years or less. And so at that point, we're no longer applying the red lines here.
On the Guyton-Klinger versus Income Lab comparison, you started at the same initial income. Would the Income Lab calculation have recommended the initial withdrawal rate be higher or lower?
So I wouldn't say Guyton-Klinger, and maybe I'm just misremembering, but I don't think there was a way to determine the initial withdrawal rate that was kind of, systematic or something. And so actually in the test, what we did is we took the Income Lab plan with risk-based guardrails, and the initial income was based on that risk level, which was, I just chose the default, which is right in the middle of that risk slider, which is equivalent in our world to a risk of 20 out of 100, or you could think of it as, it would have had an 80% probability of success if you were doing typical Monte Carlo. And we just made Guyton-Klinger start at the same level. So that's the way that we made them apples to apples comparisons. The examples I've used here were 5% withdrawals, basically because then the 20% is an easy, in your head math to go up to 6 or down to 4. There may even have been that example in those articles, but I don't think there was anything, particularly important about starting at 5% in those examples. Derek, do you recall?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually in the Guyton-Klinger paper, I'm pretty sure they just give a range of potential starting distribution rates. They don't even give there's no predefined level. And in my experience, seeing advisors that have spreadsheets built or other tools that they're using, they tend to they do gravitate towards some typical starting distribution rate that I think they prefer. But yeah, I think from the methodology, as Justin described, really just trying to get an apples to apples comparison.
Yeah, I think typically if it is a 30-year plan with a 60-40 portfolio or something, people like to start above 4%, basically because, there should be some payoff to having adjustments, which is, well, maybe I can at least spend a bit more sometimes than that kind of, basic rule of thumb.
Mm-hmm. And to bring this though to, practical context of if you are playing around with the sliders in Income Lab, right? That is something that is going to be changing if you go to a more conservative risk setting. You're going to be bringing that initial distribution down. It's not going to be holding that fixed at any particular level. And so that's part of what you see is, okay, yes, if you're trying to compare different Income Lab scenarios to each other, is that initial income is dropping to help provide more of a flattened income experience.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So for example, the worst performing one on Income Lab was here. You might say if you really think, stagflation type is environment is really what I want to pay attention to here. I want to build a plan that would do well in that scenario. You might say, well, then this is too risky. And so you might move that slider over and say, hey, let's spend a little less today so that we know we wouldn't have to make such a huge reduction in real spending in, the worst possible periods of stagflation. So it's just a trade-off between spending and the volatility of the income experience over time. So you can spend more if you can stomach volatility in bad times, or you spend less if you'd rather, pay the price of spending less in order to have less volatility in bad times.
And quick, while we're on this kind of, finding the guardrails that work for a client topic, the other thing I find myself using a lot now is that income ceiling setting, where I can actually set and say, okay, the client's not going to spend over a certain level, because that'll help flatten out something like this, scenario. I don't know this scenario specifically, but when you do have a dip that's a little bit too much of a dip, that's another way to potentially adjust that, is by adjusting the ceiling, taking less upside potential, but then smoothing out the downside.
Yeah, that's right. Especially if there are increases early in the plan, for example, here we go from, I think it's about, 3,700 a month, and there is a reduction. It's pretty late in the plan, so maybe it's not actually that big of a deal, but, you might have said, okay, this is enough. let's not take that next increase. And so you would have smoothed things out if you said, hey, there's a ceiling to how much I'm going to spend. At some point, I'll just let it accrue in my portfolio. All right, I think we have like 2 minutes left. Let me see. There's a few.
And just a reminder, saying on this comment, after you exit the webinar, you will have a quick survey where you can fill out the information and give us the CFPCE credit. Justin, I'm seeing one here, just an interesting one. Any plans to include the Guyton-Klinger plan in Income Lab for modeling purposes?
No plans at the moment. I mean, if we had people clamoring for it, I suppose we might, but it would be there really just as a way to show like this is probably not what you want to do. So yeah, I don't think so at the moment, but we're always listening.
I think that covers the.
All right, we can try to address some of these over email for folks. Yeah. But somebody did have a question. I can address this one really quickly. If I set the legacy goal to 0, will there be a lot more adjustments late in life? In theory, there would be. Like if we knew you were dying on a certain day, you could just say, okay, spend the rest of your money. But in these plans, we're always assuming you do have a life expectancy. So you never hit the point where you are tomorrow, your plan ends. And so there is, you say, is there basically a buffer built in? Yeah, essentially there's a longevity buffer, which is we're never assuming we know when you'll die, and so you'll never spend that last dollar. And that's the same in this test for risk-based, or even we did it with Guyton-Klinger. So yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for your amazing questions here. Justin, Derek, thank you so much for putting this together. As I mentioned, please fill out the survey at the end. If we didn't get to your questions, we will review some of them and send you some email responses to the ones that we can. And then please look out for the invites for next month's Lab Talk Tuesday, as well as next month's Retirement Income Intel. And then we will look forward to see you all on the next one. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Everybody.